For centuries, the Shroud of Turin has become one of the most mysterious and controversial pieces of cloth on the face of the planet.
The Shroud of Turin is believed by many Christians to be Jesus Christ's burial cloth, a relic of the resurrection.
Who knew that even in this age of cutting-edge technology, scientists would fail to unravel the mystery of a mere piece of ancient cloth? For decades, the Shroud of Turin had been extremely scrutinized.
The Shroud of Turin is a rectangular piece of linen cloth, roughly 14.5 feet by 3.5 feet, which many people believe to be the burial shroud of Jesus.
Stretched and even torn to reveal its mysteries, but all studies proved elusive. The shroud appeared to hold phenomenons science could not comprehend, and so doubts of its authenticity set in. However, recently a new study finally discovered something shocking about the shroud. Will this change the waves of religion? Perhaps even reveal the secrets of our history?
When they studied the shroud with more sophisticated technology, they discovered that there was 3D information encoded.
Join us as we delve into the new revelation of the Shroud of Turin that is causing an uproar in the scientific and religious community. Is the Shroud of Turin real or fake? For centuries, debate has raged over whether the Shroud of Turin is the original burial shroud of Jesus Christ after his crucifixion about 2,000 years ago. While many believe it to be the real thing,
the Shroud of Turin is a burial cloth that shows a man that was scourged, crowned with thorns, crucified, and pierced with a lance.
Others have dismissed it as a medieval fake. One of the most studied artifacts ever, the shroud has kept historians engaged partly because of the debate on its true age, but largely because of the inexplicable image of a crucified man that seems imprinted on it. According to the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Joseph of Arimathea wrapped the body of Jesus in a linen shroud, sinden, and placed it in a new tomb. The Gospel of John says he used linen cloth. But is this mentioned linen the Shroud of Turin? You are just about to find out the shocking truth.
Findings being published in a new book out today on the Shroud of Turin. That's the linen cloth believed to bear Jesus' imprint as he was being prepared for burial.
Measuring 14 feet 3 inches long and 3 feet 7 inches wide, this shroud believed by many to be the burial cloth of Jesus, as described in the Gospel, indeed portrays two faint brownish images, those of the back and front of a gaunt, sunken-eyed, 5 foot 7 inch tall man, as if a body had been laid on its back lengthwise along one half of the shroud, while the other half had been doubled over the head to cover the whole front of the body, from face to feet. The images contain markings that allegedly correspond to the crucifixion wounds of Jesus, including thorn marks on the head, lacerations as if from flogging on the back, bruises on the shoulders, and various stains of what is presumed to be blood. The documented history of the shroud dates back to 1354, when it was exhibited in the new collegiate church of Lirey, a village in north-central France. The shroud was denounced as a forgery by the Bishop of Troyes, Pierre d'Arcis, in 1389.
It is thought that the Shroud of Turin was among those taken. In 1353, a devoutly religious member of the Knights Templar, Geoffroy de Charny, came into possession of the shroud and had it transported to a monastery in Lirey, France, for safekeeping.
It was acquired by the House of Savoy in 1453 and later deposited in a chapel in Chambéry, where it was damaged by fire in 1532. There are some burn holes and scorched areas down both sides of the linen, caused by contact with molten silver during the fire that burned through it in places while it was folded. 14 large triangular patches and 8 smaller ones were sewn onto the cloth by Poor Clare's nuns to repair the damage. In 1578, the Savoys moved the shroud to their new capital in Turin, where it has remained ever since. A fire, possibly caused by arson, also threatened the shroud on the 11th of April, 1997. The shroud has undergone several restorations, and several steps have been taken to preserve it to avoid further damage and contamination. Since 1578, the shroud has been preserved in the Royal Chapel of the Cathedral of San Giovanni Battista in Turin, Italy, and for centuries has been the focus of debates about its authenticity and an object of devotion by those who believe that it is truly a relic of Christ. Scholarly analyses attempting to use scientific methods to prove or disprove its authenticity have been applied to the shroud since the late 19th century. In 1898, it was noticed that the sepia tone images on the shroud seemed to have the character of photographic negatives rather than positives.
The Shroud of Turin is an ancient piece of linen believed to be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. It bears the full-length image of a man who was brutally beaten, pierced, and bleeding.
Beginning in the 1970s, tests were made to determine whether the images were the result of paints or other pigments, scorches, or other agents. Believe it or not, none of the tests proved conclusive. The origin of the image could not be accounted for by any scientific method, and even more baffling, could not be replicated. Attempts to replicate the image using known artistic techniques or natural processes have largely failed to reproduce its three-dimensional quality and the absence of visible pigments. This has led researchers to explore hypotheses involving complex interactions of light, radiation, and chemical processes that may have occurred during the shroud's production. In 1988, the Vatican provided 3 laboratories in different countries with postage stamp-sized pieces of the shroud's linen cloth.
In 1988, a group of scientists were able to get permission to get a sample from the shroud and to subject it to radiocarbon dating.
Having subjected these samples to carbon-14 dating, all 3 laboratories concluded that the cloth of the shroud had been made sometime between 1260 and 1390, thus indicating that it was inauthentic and not from the time of Jesus. However, some scientists raised doubts about the researchers' methodology. Upon receiving the results of the tests, the Vatican encouraged scientists to conduct further investigations of the shroud's authenticity and recommended that Christians continue to venerate the shroud as an inspiring image of Christ. Carbon dating, once hailed as the definitive method to determine the shroud's age, now faces intense scrutiny amid evolving scientific techniques and interdisciplinary research. When carbon dating was first applied to the shroud in 1988, it ignited skepticism among scholars and believers alike. It conflicted with the long-held belief that the shroud was the actual cloth used to wrap Jesus after his crucifixion. Criticisms soon emerged regarding the sampling method and the possibility of contamination over centuries of handling and storage. Detractors argued that the carbon sample, taken from the edges, did not represent the entire shroud due to its proximity and exposure to environmental factors. Critics of the 1988 carbon dating results point out several key issues. First, the sampling location near the edges of the shroud, which were historically handled and repaired, raises contamination concerns. The cloth had been publicly displayed and venerated for centuries, potentially exposing it to various pollutants and environmental conditions that could skew the carbon dating results. Moreover, the precise historical context of the shroud's preservation and its exposure to events like the 1532 fire in Chambéry, France, further complicates the carbon dating analysis. However, this week, it was the turn of the result of a new investigation into the age of the shroud, which seemingly yields strong evidence that it does, in fact, date back to the time of Jesus Christ.
Scientists have confirmed that the shroud was indeed manufactured approximately 2,000 years ago, during the same time period Christ lived, was crucified,
that once again threw the artifact into the headlines. Sit tight, because what they discovered will blow your mind. The real age of the Shroud of Turin finally revealed. In recent years, the radiocarbon dating data have been repeatedly statistically analyzed in attempts to draw some conclusions about the reliability of the carbon dating from studying the data rather than studying the shroud itself. The studies have all concluded that the data lack homogeneity, which might be due to unidentified abnormalities in the fabric tested or to differences in the pre-testing cleaning processes used by the different laboratories. Just like they proposed, that seems to be the case, as proven by a most recent analysis. The latest study was conducted by Italian scientist Liberato De Caro, who began his research in 2019 and published his findings in a journal called Heritage in 2022. De Caro and his team from the Institute of Crystallography in Bari, Italy, part of the National Research Council, used a technique known as wide-angle X-ray scattering to analyze a piece of the shroud's linen. The study concluded that the structural degradations of the shroud's linen were fully compatible with those of another linen sample that has been dated, according to historical records, to 5574 CE. Environmental carbon contamination was suggested as the source of the discrepancy between those findings and the results of the carbon dating in the 1980s. The 2022 study's results bolstered the hypothesis that the Shroud of Turin truly is from the time of Christ. The experimental results are compatible with the hypothesis that the Turin Shroud is a 2000-year-old relic, the study said. However, further study and analysis are required to verify the precise date of origin of the shroud, and further X-ray analysis will be required, it concluded. Has an end finally come to this troubling phenomenon? Well, that's not all. A new study from an Italian researcher that analyzes the blood on the Shroud of Turin argues that the stains are consistent with the torture and crucifixion of Jesus Christ, as described in the Gospels. Giulio Fanti, a professor of mechanical and thermal measurements at the University of Padua, claims that a macroscopic and microscopic analysis of the bloodstains accurately reflects the physical conditions relating to Jesus Christ that is consistent with the description of Jesus Christ in the Holy Bible, and in particular, within the 4 canonical Gospels. According to Fanti's study, the bloodstains on the side and the front of the shroud show blood flowing in 3 different directions: vertical with the body in an upright position, inclined at a 45-degree angle, and horizontal with the corpse resting on its side. Fanti asserts that the single rivulets show a sudden change of their direction. It is probable that the blood flows streamed when the corpse was moved. The study adds that the 3 distinct colors of blood suggest 3 different types of blood, which are post-mortem blood leakage from moving the body. Then there are the less evident ones that appear to be pre-mortem blood stains that likely occurred when Jesus was still nailed to the cross, and leaks of blood serum. It adds that the stains appear to show scourge marks consistent with the scourging at the pillar, and that the quantity of blood matches the amount of blood that would have resulted from the wounds described in the Gospels. Additionally, nanoparticles found in the blood recognized as creatinine are consistent with the very heavy torture suffered by Jesus, according to the study. It adds that the high level of urea hypothesized in some of the blood implies renal malfunction or blockage, which is a condition compatible with intense flagellation in the area of the kidneys, causing microcytic anemia.
It's the loss of water and blood, and that would entail either either pleural effusion or pericardial effusion, and the blood would have come from either pulmonary artery, pulmonary vein, the aorta or vena cava, or the heart.
The study furthermore says that this microcytic anemia, also increased by prolonged fasting, suggests the extreme difficulties Jesus had in exchanging oxygen, which most likely resulted in extremely labored breathing. Jesus had to heavily increase his breathing, the study adds, and consequently increase the frequency of his heartbeats, which prompted a heart attack as the main cause of his death. Father Robert Spitzer, a Jesuit priest and president of the Magis Center of Reason and Faith, told CNA that all of these indications found in Fanti's study coincide with the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Spitzer said that the creatinine in the blood generally indicates severe injuries in multiple locations, adding that the blood came from a person who had undergone tremendous heavy polytrauma. The man certainly was struggling to breathe as well, Spitzer said, citing the findings in the study. He had undergone real torture. You can tell that he lost a tremendous amount of blood, especially from the whipping, the scourging that he received.
The man was severely beaten. He was crowned with thorns, and these thorns were huge, and they covered not only the sides of the head, as we see in medieval renditions and paintings of it, but also the top of the head, and it's just pushed into his head to make sure that it penetrates into the skull.
According to Spitzer, the blood evidence points to the unique crucifixion of Jesus on the cross. In defending the authenticity of the shroud, he said a medieval forger could not have possibly anticipated 21 century scientific studies of the cloth. He certainly would not have used the hematic serum of a victim who experienced a heavy polytrauma. Spitzer referenced other recent studies to defend the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin, particularly the 2022 wide-angle X-ray scattering analysis published by Italian researchers at the National Research Council in Bari. Additionally, Spitzer criticized the 1988 carbon dating study as unreliable, alleging contamination can affect carbon dating, and that the researchers only took material from a small portion of the shroud rather than taking multiple samples from different parts of the shroud. He noted that the Shroud of Turin was damaged in a fire in the 1500s and repaired with material from that era, and asserted that the fabric used in the carbon dating study is not the same as the linen cloth that the rest of the shroud is made of, but instead, fabric added during the repair in the Middle Ages. But while the mystery of the shroud's age is gradually unraveling, many things about the shroud remain otherworldly. One of these enigmas is the image on the shroud, the mystery of the shroud's image. As time goes on, endless puzzle pieces continue to come off this mysterious artifact. One is the distinct image on both the front and back of the shroud, as though the cloth collapsed into and through a body. There is no scientific explanation of how this could have happened unless the body became mechanically transparent, causing the cloth to collapse into it. If the cloth did collapse into the body, then an ultraviolet light would have surrounded the body. This would produce a double image on both the front and the back of the cloth, but nothing on the fibers in the middle. Another mystery is that the bones of the hand look as if they are covered with flesh. One can see inside the body as though through an X-ray. The process that made the photograph recorded the inside of the hand, including the skeleton, but simultaneously also recorded the outside of the hand, the flesh that envelops the skeleton.
An image like no other, inspiring decades of research and debate. The Shroud of Turin, that's a piece of history, and it has an ongoing puzzle for science.
The Shroud of Turin is a burial cloth that's imprinted with what many believe is the actual image of Jesus after his crucifixion. Now, it's been debated for years, but the shroud is back in the headlines in a major way.
In a world where religion and science intersect, one ancient piece of linen seems to hold the key to some of humanity's most profound beliefs. That's the Shroud of Turin. For a piece of cloth that stands as proof of the crucifixion of Jesus,
the Shroud of Turin is believed by many Christians to be Jesus Christ's burial cloth, a relic of the resurrection.
The Shroud of Turin has been the subject of intense debate for centuries, captivating not only the faithful, but also scientists in their labs. With the majority suggesting several contradictory opinions about the cloth, it's been more of a puzzle than a shred of evidence ever since. However, recent research has revealed something assuring but still terrifying. What is the new study about, and how scary is it? Join us as we look into the true nature of the Shroud of Turin. The past research on the Shroud of Turin. Compared to the several other shrouds of kings and queens,
Scotland discovered an ancient Egyptian burial cloth, thousands of years old. The full-length shroud shows the deceased as an Egyptian god.
The Shroud of Turin has proven to be more valuable in the years that have passed. While some might say it's probably because of the history the piece of cloth had experienced, there are a few others who believe the shroud would be the sole thing that collapses the long-standing wall between science and faith. As such, for what has long been a relic passed on to generations, the Shroud of Turin is now more of a specimen that has undergone several scrutiny by scientists to determine its worth. Literally, you can say each one of them who might have attempted to put the cloth under a microscope is in search of answers. They are looking for hints and answers pertaining to the cloth's origin, its nature, and the owner of the body that the shroud envelops. And while it's safe to say there have been a little bit of progress in the past years, there seems to be a whole lot of contradictory opinions that have discredited a whole lot of research on the shroud.
All four of the Gospels mention that Jesus was taken down from the cross. He was wrapped in linen, and then his body was put in the tomb.
However, for a time like ours, when advanced research and study have been made way easier, it appears as though the answers have been finally gotten. In truth, it's way more perplexing than you imagine. This statement stands true, especially when you consider how terrifying the answers we've long searched for are. Still, everyone can agree that it was long overdue for us to get the answers we desired. talking about research and our long search for answers, the investigation of the Shroud of Turin goes way back to the 1970s. At the time, there was a specific research team assigned to unveil all the mysteries behind the shroud. This team comprised American scientists from a variety of fields like physics, radiology, chemistry, and photography. Altogether, they were to oversee the project known as the Shroud of Turin Research Project, STURP. As a matter of fact, their research was groundbreaking at the time because it was the very first extensive scientific analysis of the relic.
I cannot tell you who this man was, and neither can anyone else. Science is never going to be able to say that we can prove the name of the man that was once upon a time wrapped in the Shroud of Turin.
Thanks to their findings, this group would go a long way to stir decades of debates about the shroud's authenticity. Looking at how they went about their research, you'd find out that the team's approach was one that was both methodical and deeply analytical. Over the course of 5 days in Turin, Italy, the team had all the access they needed to the shroud. As a means to research, they used basically everything from their arsenal. From ultraviolet and infrared photography down to X-ray fluorescence and chemical tests, they only had one assignment. That was to answer the question of whether the shroud was a result of a medieval forgery or if it was truly linked to the burial cloth of Jesus Christ.
The Shroud of Turin is an ancient piece of linen believed to be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ.
So did they? Well, not really. By the end of their sessions, they had answers, but they weren't the definitive kind. One of their most intriguing conclusions was that the image of the man on the shroud was not painted, printed, or drawn. Instead, they suggested that the image was a result of a particularly unknown process that caused a superficial discoloration on the topmost fibers of the linen. Now that's what the group told us. However, there was a little bit of bias or oversight when the research group was trying to give conclusive answers. Apparently, when they started their research, they never approached the Shroud of Turin as a miraculous object, but as a mystery object. At the time, this was more or less the only way to follow a more scientific logic and reasoning. Mind you, they did identify bloodstains on the cloth. However, they never emphasized how the wounds matched the crucifixion accounts. This very act was one of the things that added an extra layer of mystery to the origin of the relic. That aside, their research was not without controversy. People who were criticizing their results back then pointed out that the team had not directly dated the fabric. In the eyes of many, this not only makes the results of their research invalid, it also makes it appear inconclusive. So they clearly had an unfinished business. Eventually, another opportunity came several years later with the infamous 1988 carbon dating test.
The 1988 test, carbon dating, that they say, well, this isn't 2,000 years old, so therefore it's done.
This time, they were able to pinpoint the fact that the cloth was from the medieval era. What this result meant was that the Shroud of Turin was not the burial shroud of Jesus. You might probably wonder why that poses an explanation. Well, it's all a matter of time. The medieval era is not the era when Jesus was crucified. He was believed to have been crucified in the 1st century AD, around 30 to 33 AD, when the Roman Empire was quite dominant and prevalent. On the other hand, the medieval era, which is also known as the Middle Ages, began way much later, starting in the 5th century AD, around the fall of the Roman Empire, and it lasted until the late 15th century. The carbon dating test conducted on the Shroud of Turin suggested that the shroud had originated from a date range of 1260 to 1390 AD. This was long after the time of Jesus.
Scientists who in 1988 used carbon dating to determine the age of the fabric say it's not old enough to be the cloth used to wrap Jesus' body.
So basically, this fact alone discredited the chances that it was the shroud used to bury Jesus. Or so we thought. It later turned out that their research couldn't be validated by the researchers and scientists after them. So what do you think were their own opinions on the matter? And how valid were their results compared to those of the Shroud of Turin research project team? Stay back as we unveil the true nature of the Shroud of Turin. The contradictory opinions of the Shroud of Turin and its history. As far as the Shroud of Turin is concerned, there were a few other researchers who managed to lay their hands on the cloth. While some were attempting to conduct their own research, others were looking to corroborate the findings of the Shroud of Turin research project team. Because of the several analyses done, it wasn't long before people started to see the flaws and inconsistencies of the STURP team. One of the people who pointed out this flaw was the Swiss criminologist Max Frey. Apparently, in 1973, Max conducted a fascinating study on the Shroud of Turin using sticky tape. Yes, you heard that right. It was an actual sticky tape. He collected pollen samples from the cloth, hoping to trace the shroud back to its origin. And somehow, he was able to do just that. Now here's the interesting part. The pollen that was identified on the shroud was pollen from plants native to various regions like Palestine, Turkey, and Europe. However, that which was most dominant was from the species that only grew in the Middle East, most especially in Jerusalem. What this discovery meant was that the shroud had been exposed the most to air in these regions. Hence, it points to the possibility of the shroud being from an ancient region consistent with the time and location of Jesus' crucifixion. What do you think? Do you think that's a coincidence? Let's not forget Max Frey conducted this study even before the cloth underwent carbon dating. So even though his study might contradict that of the STURP team, the subsequent results from the carbon dating analysis contradict Max Frey's study as well. That is quite true. You can say that we are supposed to follow the logic behind science with the results from carbon dating. However, before choosing a narrative to stick to, you should hear what the chemist Ray Rogers had to say from his own findings.
No one was more shocked than Rogers himself. His initial observation seemed to confirm Benford and Marino's hypothesis.
As a matter of fact, it all happened in 2005, at a time when most of the tales and debates about the Shroud of Turin were already starting to die down. Then came Ray Rogers, who was again willing to conduct a chemical analysis on the fibers from the shroud. While many thought they already knew the results that he'd get, to everyone's surprise, it wasn't what anyone expected. Apparently, Rogers blatantly had stepped out to say that the carbon dating results from 1988 were incorrect. In his defense, he said that the sample used in the dating had been taken from a section of the shroud that had been repaired in the Middle Ages, and not the actual thing. While Rogers thrived to bring clarity on the subject, he narrated how he discovered that the fibers from the dated sample contained cotton and had been treated with a dye that was not found in the rest of the shroud. What's more, his analysis found significant differences in the chemical composition of the dated fibers and those from other parts of the shroud. Still, he didn't stop there. He also tested the rate of vanillin loss in the linen. Seeing that the original shroud didn't have any left, he was able to confirm that the chemical had degraded over time. This was one of the things that testified to the difference in age between the pieces of cloth sewn together. And so, just like that, the possibility of the Shroud of Turin dating back to the time of Christ once again came alive once again. But then, how did the other half of the shroud come to be in the first place? And why do you think there are so many contradictory opinions skewing the results from the research all these years? Well, to fully understand the story behind the Shroud of Turin, we'd have to take a little detour by opening the history books. The Shroud of Turin, which is a piece of cloth believed to be the burial cloth of Jesus, measures around 14 feet in length and 3 feet 7 inches in width. You can say what led to the claims by many was the picture of two faint images of a man with sunken eyes and the wound marks on the images corresponding to the crucifixion of Jesus. Apparently, the shroud has a picture of thorn marks on the head of the man with lacerations.
The Shroud of Turin is this amazing relic. At bottom, it's a piece of cloth. It shows a very faint sort of image of a crucified man,
as if telling a story of just how much pain the man had faced. The full apparel depicts not just the face of a man who'd faced agony, but there are also traces showing that a man 5 feet and 7 inches in height had been buried with the cloth. Now that much is known. Regardless, it gets even way more interesting with the history behind the shroud. As it stands, studies and research have proven that the Shroud of Turin has lived a long and mysterious life, which led it to be passed down through centuries. While the initial person who possessed the shroud still remains a mystery, the first time the shroud came to the public's notice in 1354 was in the possession of the knight Geoffroy de Charny. It turns out that Charny had displayed the cloth in a small church in Lirey, France at that time, being pretty excited to be in possession of the shroud himself. While others saw the relic as a cause to get excited and steadfast in their beliefs, there were others who didn't see it as a possible burial cloth of Jesus Christ himself. In truth, there were the people who were more in the middle. They just thought it impossible for them to have such an extraordinary piece of object right in front of them. Yet the shroud continued to inspire devotion.
Glimpse of the Shroud of Turin, one of the rarest pieces of history, will be on display.
Talking about the journey of the shroud, you should know it wasn't always smooth. One of the most harrowing moments came in 1532 when disaster struck. By then, the shroud was under the care of the House of Savoy. Being that there were very few places they could keep a delicate artifact like the Shroud of Turin, the only option at the time was to keep it in the chapel of the Holy Shroud in Chambéry, France. So, they did exactly that. However, what came as a shock was that on a cold night in December, a fire broke out in the chapel, threatening to destroy this sacred relic forever. As a matter of fact, the flames that had already spread were already melting the silver reliquary that encased the shroud, and if not for the intervention of the priests, it would have been old news. It turns out that when they finally managed to rescue the cloth, it was already slightly damaged by the molten silver that dripped on it, and it had a couple of holes and burns. Immediately after the catastrophe, the shroud disappeared, and many thought it was lost. However, it later reappeared in 1534, being under the care of the Poor Clare nuns. With meticulous care, they patched the shroud with triangular pieces of fabric and reinforced it with a backing cloth to stabilize it.
He was a simple priest in southern Italy, known for having supernatural gifts, including the stigmata, the same wounds Jesus received at his crucifixion. Catholics and even non-religious around the world now know him as Saint Padre Pio.
Some people say that he channeled his prophecies. I think he just went into either a higher state of consciousness or a very deep meditative state, and he was seeing things that he then would write about.
As we approach the year 2025, one of the most striking prophecies of Padre Pio is once again bringing attention to his remarkable legacy, and what he did during his last days has left everyone shocked. With his reputation for spiritual insight and foresight, Padre Pio's prophecies have always been fulfilled, leaving scholars and believers in awe, with many seeking to understand the depth of his prophetic gift. What did Padre Pio foresee? And what lasting impact does he hold towards humanity's future? Join us in this video as we reveal this last moment of Padre Pio that left everyone stunned.
And I only had a quick chance to skim through it, but it concerns Padre Pio. And Padre Pio, of course, was the saint.
The last moment of Padre Pio and what he uttered. On the final day of Padre Pio, he said something that had deep meanings. Padre Pio had lived a life of long suffering. It was said that even during his last days, Jesus appeared and spoke to him. At his final moment, he was so weak, he repeated the name Jesus Mary while clutching a rosary, and then suddenly something supernatural began to happen. It appeared he was seeing things, something no one around him could see, and he managed to say a few things before he died. What he said holds deep meaning, and many decided to look into what he said to get a better understanding. There were so many supernatural things that happened before he finally died.
These are newly released photographs of the saint Padre Pio.
And one of the most puzzling parts is what happened immediately after he died. What did Padre Pio utter? And what is this mystery surrounding his death? Keep watching to find out. To give full details of everything that happened, let's start with that day before he died. It was September 22nd, and he wanted to die on his feet, so he told his Capuchin brothers to recommend him to the Lord. Padre saw his death coming, and he was never afraid of death. He Capuchin said that during his last days. There was a picture of Saint Joseph hung near his cell, and anything he wants to pass there, he will gaze at it in silence. He was actually praying for Joseph for a happy death. The Capuchin brothers had said that everything felt different. The monastery of Our Lady Grace, the walls, the corridors was pervaded by what was described as mystical. And even during that time, no one knew he would pass away, only Padre himself. During these last days, he wrote a letter to Padre Ostino, recalling his pilgrimage days and why he wants to return home and be with God for eternity.
On March 3 in the year 1962, one of the four missionaries, Conchita, received a typed letter. The letter was sent from Italy.
He wrote, "Living here below is wearisome to me, my dear father. It is such a bitter torment to me to live in exile that I can hardly go any longer. The thought that at any moment I could lose Jesus terrifies me, in a way I cannot explain." He also spoke to his superiors and asked that they pray for him. Padre Pio insisted on celebrating Mass as he had always done. His entire life had been an offering to God, and even in his weakest state, he sought to give one final offering of the Eucharist. Padre Pio's worldwide prayer groups were present at the Mass. They carried out thanksgiving for the official approval and recognition that had recently been received from the Holy Office in Rome, and they were filled with great joy. The chapel was filled with both his closest followers and others who had journeyed to be in his presence. They knew that his health had been steadily declining, but there was something about this particular Mass that felt different. The air was thick with a mix of sadness and reverence. Padre Pio was assisted by other priests, as his frailty prevented him from standing for long periods. His voice, once booming with strength, had softened to a whisper, and his hands trembled as he raised the chalice and offered the consecration. Though his physical body was weak, the fervor of his devotion never wavered. The night leading to his death, he had called Padre Pelino, who took turns with Padre Honorat and Padre Mariana in supporting him, to his room. And when he entered his room, he found him on his bed and noticed that his eyes were red with tears. Why would Padre be in tears? He wanted to know, but Padre only called him to ask what the time was. He then cleaned Padre Pio's eyes with a handkerchief and told him what the time was. In the dying moments, Padre said, "If the Lord calls me today, ask the brothers to forgive me for all the trouble I have been in, and ask them and all my spiritual children to pray for my soul." He then said he wanted to renew his vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience.
The partially reconstructed remains of Padre Pio have begun an overland journey to the Vatican.
He said, "I, Padre Pio of Pietrelcina, vow and promise the Almighty God, to the Blessed Virgin Mary, to our Holy Father, Saint Francis, to all saints, and to you, Father, to observe all the days of my life the rule of the Friars Minor confirmed by Pope Honorius, and to live in obedience, without property, and in chastity." The last moments of Padre Pio's life were filled with a deep sense of calm, reflection, and profound faith, a fitting end to the life of a man revered for his extraordinary piety and miraculous deeds. At midnight, he made his final confession and renewed his Franciscan. He was so weak he could barely speak. His voice was growing fainter than Padre Pio began to stare intently at the picture on the wall. He wanted to know who it was. A father there answered that it was the pictures of his father and mother. "But I see two mothers," Padre said, and immediately, and he mentioned he was seeing two mothers, his body grew weaker. He broke out into a cold sweat, and his lips began to turn blue. The doctors arrived in less than 10 minutes and realized that Padre Pio had a severe bronchial asthma attack. One of them gave him an injection as well as oxygen in an attempt to ease his breathing, which had become difficult and labored. The doctors were just trying to do their work and the best they could to help him. The Capuchin kneeled down beside him, and the Padre prayed to our Heavenly Father, the Hail Mary as well, saying, "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, I give you my heart and my soul, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. Assist me in my last agony. May my soul peacefully expire in you." The Capuchin prepared the holy oil, and Father Pao gave the last rites.
They waited, many their whole lives, to experience the mystery of Padre Pio.
Padre was perspiring heavily, and the doctor realized he was having a heart attack. He was injected directly into his heart, and his eyes closed slowly, and he continued to repeat the words, "Jesus, Mary." Gradually, that got to the point he couldn't even call out his Capuchin again. He could say anything, not even a whisper. He opened his eyes one last time at 2:30 a.m. on September 23rd, and his rosary clasped in his hands, and he gently whispered those words. I saw two mothers before he bowed his head and died. His death was met with a quiet stillness. For a moment, no one moved, as if time itself had stopped. The friars present were overcome with emotion, grief for the loss of their beloved Padre, but also a sense of awe and reverence for the peaceful way he had left the world. There was no fear in his passing, only a profound sense of acceptance and trust in the God to whom he had dedicated his entire life. And immediately he died. What began to happen shocked everyone. His stigmata wound on his feet disappeared less and less. It was supernatural. A day before he still had a raised scab, 2 scales from his hands fell. So when he died, the doctor examined his feet and sides, but it all disappeared. His skin was so smooth like a newborn baby, everybody was marveled. Such a thing has never been seen. The stigmata, which had marked him for half a century, had vanished. The wounds that had bled and caused him immense pain were gone, as if they had never existed. The last sign of the wounds of Christ he carried on his body for over 50 years looked very beautiful. It was as if God had chosen to erase all physical signs of his suffering, leaving behind only the memory of his holiness. The rosary was still placed in his hands, as were the rules of the St. Francis. Those present could not believe what they were witnessing. The stigmata had been a central part of Padre Pio's identity, a visible sign of his mystical union with Christ's suffering. And yet, in death, they were gone. It was as if Padre Pio's mission on earth had been completed, and now he was free from the physical manifestations of his sufferings. The smell of roses filled the room.
Last Saturday, September 23rd, was the feast day of Padre Pio, down in the United States.
It was a scent that had often been associated with Padre Pio during his life, particularly during moments of intense spiritual significance. Now, in death, the fragrance of roses seemed to confirm that Padre Pio was in the presence of the divine. Those who were with him in his final moments felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that he had been welcomed into heaven. He actually had severe arthritis. He used a wheelchair to support himself, but at night he stood straight. It was said that the night before he died, he stood up and turned on the light, staring directly at the place where his lifeless body would later be buried. As he continued to stare directly, no one knew what was happening. His body began to grow weaker, and he repeated, "Jesus, Mary." He knew his lifeless body would end at that same place. He was born holy, he died holy. One of his touching prayers during his last days was, "I need to love you more and more, but I don't have any more love in my heart. I have given all my love to you. If you want more, fill my heart with your love, and then oblige me to love you more, and I will not refuse you." He was praying before a wooden crucifix. He was overwhelmed by numbness and drowsiness, and then he fell asleep on the floor. When he woke up, he was covered in blood. That very moment, Padre Pio's stigmata became the core of controversy that divided the religious and other people. Right from time, Pio was destined to carry out the mission of carrying the cross on his shoulders. Padre Pio was born as Francesco Forgione. He was wrapped in a white veil, and that was a good sign he would be holy. His parents, Grazio and Maria Forgione, were humble farmers who instilled a deep faith in their children. From an early age, young Francesco exhibited an unusual piety, often praying and experiencing visions of the Virgin Mary and Jesus. Despite his family's poverty, his parents supported his desire to become a priest, even sending his father to work in America to fund his education. Francesco's early life was marked by a strong connection to spirituality, foreshadowing the profound religious role he would play as Padre Pio.
Worshippers wait anxiously to catch a glimpse of the sacred relic.
He liked to remain alone, listening to distant voices, mysterious heavenly utterances, and echoes of invisible bells. Time and again, Padre Pio's predictions manifested in ways that left those who encountered him in awe of his deep connection with God. Yet, despite the clear evidence of his sanctity, Padre Pio endured intense persecution, cruel accusations, and relentless humiliation throughout his life, particularly from within the very institution he loved, the Catholic Church. Let's look at how accurate his predictions have been. Padre Pio predictions and prophecies that happened. Padre Pio's predictions were not vague or obscure, but direct, often foretelling specific events with remarkable clarity. One of his most famous prophecies involved the Second World War. In 1918, Padre Pio predicted that a terrible war would engulf the world, one that would bring untold suffering and destruction. This prophecy, which seemed improbable at the time, became a chilling reality with the outbreak of World War II. Similarly, Padre Pio was known to foretell the future of individuals who came to him for spiritual guidance. Many would later confirm that his insights, even about personal matters, were startlingly accurate. Padre Pio's most profound prophecies were often spiritual in nature. He warned about the decline of faith in the modern world and the rise of secularism, predicting a future in which humanity would face increasing alienation from God. In his vision, this estrangement would lead to a profound spiritual crisis, with people struggling to find meaning in a rapidly changing world. Yet despite his divine gifts, Padre Pio was far from immune to suffering. His life was marked not only by spiritual rapture, but by bitter trials that often came at the hands of those who should have supported him the most. For all the admiration he garnered from the faithful, Padre Pio's life was overshadowed by persecution. The most painful aspect of this persecution was that it came not from outside the church, but from within. Church authorities, including the Vatican, were deeply suspicious of Padre Pio's mystical experiences. They questioned the authenticity of his stigmata.
The Lord Jesus appeared to him, and the Lord Jesus' hands, side, and feet were bleeding. And when this apparition ended, Saint Padre Pio found that his hands, side, and feet were also bleeding. And we call this the gift of the stigmata. Saint Padre Pio received the gift of the stigmata,
which had first appeared in 1918. Some suggested that the wounds were self-inflicted, despite medical examinations that failed to provide any natural explanation for them. Padre Pio's growing popularity also seemed to provoke jealousy and resentment among some clergy members. His reputation as a miracle worker and his ability to draw massive crowds to his confessional and masses aroused suspicions of fanaticism. Some church officials feared that Padre Pio's cult-like following could destabilize the local diocese and undermine their authority. In 1922, these suspicions led the Vatican to open an investigation into Padre Pio's life. A team of medical and theological experts was dispatched to study him. Their conclusions were far from favorable. They accused him of being a charlatan, suggesting that his stigmata were a result of mental illness or worse, a ploy to manipulate the faithful. In an attempt to discredit him, they claimed that he was a deluded fanatic, driven by an unholy desire for attention. Perhaps the most damaging accusations leveled against Padre Pio were those of impropriety. Despite his vow of celibacy and his well-known piety, some church officials spread rumors that he had inappropriate relationships with women. These allegations were completely unfounded, but they caused deep emotional pain to Padre Pio, who had devoted his life to chastity and religious service. That's not even all. Church authorities also accused him of financial fraud, claiming that he was using the donations from his followers for personal gain. This, too, was a baseless charge. Padre Pio had taken a vow of poverty, and any money that came to him through donations was used for charitable purposes, particularly for the construction of the Casa Sollievo della Sofferenza, which is home for the relief of suffering.
Against all odds, the hospital in San Giovanni Rotondo was built. But who did Padre Pio rely on the most? The construction of Casa Sollievo della Sofferenza in San Giovanni Rotondo was no easy feat. There were many challenges and obstacles that had to be overcome.
A hospital he founded to care for the sick and poor. Nevertheless, these false accusations of moral and financial corruption led to increased scrutiny from the Vatican. With all this happening, the Holy Office, which is the predecessor to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, issued a decree declaring that there was no evidence of supernatural phenomena in Padre Pio's case. As a result, he was banned from publicly celebrating Mass and hearing confessions. For someone whose entire life was dedicated to the priesthood, this was a crushing blow. It was a period of deep humiliation for Padre Pio, who was forced into isolation, unable to minister to the faithful who came to him seeking spiritual solace. But he was angry about it. He was calm, and he prayed to God. The years of isolation and humiliation that followed were some of the most painful in Padre Pio's life. He was confined to his monastery in San Giovanni Rotondo, forbidden from having contact with the outside world. The faithful, who had come from all over the world to see him, were turned away. Padre Pio's reputation was in tatters, and even within the church, many regarded him as a fraud. But through it all, Padre Pio remained steadfast in his faith. He accepted the persecution and humiliation as a form of suffering in union with Christ. He never lashed out against his accusers or complained about the unfair treatment he endured. Instead, he saw it as part of his spiritual journey, a way to share in the suffering of Jesus. Despite the pain, Padre Pio's deep sense of humility allowed him to endure these trials with grace. He continued to pray, to offer his daily sufferings for the salvation of souls, and to remain completely devoted to God. His quiet endurance in the face of such harsh persecution became an example to his followers, many of whom were inspired by his unwavering faith. Eventually, the tide began to turn in Padre Pio's favor. As more and more testimonies of miraculous healings and spiritual conversions began to surface, church authorities started to reconsider their stance. From that point on, Padre Pio was allowed to resume his public ministry. The end of the persecution marked the beginning of a new chapter in Padre Pio's life. His following continued to grow, and by the time of his death in 1968,
September of 1968, and Padre Pio turned to his friend, Brother Domenico, and said, "I don't think I have very long now. Pray for me." Then he said, "Farewell, and we will see each other in paradise." Within 24 hours, Padre Pio was dead.
He was revered as one of the greatest spiritual figures of the 20th century. There are puzzling things that happened when Padre died that left everyone baffled. Stay tuned as we share more, because it is very intriguing. Unbelievable things that happened, even after Padre Pio's death. News of Padre Pio's death spread quickly, and within hours, thousands of people had gathered outside the monastery. Many wept openly, while others prayed in silence. For those who had known him, either personally or through stories of his miraculous deeds, Padre Pio was more than just a priest. He was a living saint. His death was not just the passing of a beloved figure, it was the end of an era. Within days, word of the miraculous disappearance of his stigmata had spread, adding to the growing sense of awe and reverence surrounding his death. People traveled from all over Italy and beyond to pay their respects, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who had been so close to God. His body was laid out in the church, and for several days, a steady stream of mourners filed past his coffin, praying for his intercession and asking for his blessings. There were reports of miracles even after his death. Some who touched his coffin claimed to have been healed, while others spoke of feeling an overwhelming sense of peace in his presence.
When you come to the service, you just feel like his presence is here.
The point of having something of his presence is here now.
They believed that he continued to intercede for them from heaven, just as he had done during his life. Helicopters and Air Force flew over, thousands of people gathered. His body was placed in the granite crypt buried directly under the main altar of the church. In the days, weeks, and months following his death, the stories of Padre Pio's holiness and miracles only grew. His followers, who had always believed in his sanctity, now began to advocate for his canonization. They collected testimonies of the many miracles attributed to him, both during his life and after his death. In 2002, Padre Pio was officially canonized as a saint by Pope John Paul II, solidifying his place as one of the most beloved and revered figures in the Catholic Church. But for those who had been with him in his final moments, no official recognition was necessary. They had seen firsthand the extraordinary grace and holiness that had marked his life and death. The disappearance of his stigmata, the scent of roses, the peaceful expression on his face as he passed, all these were signs that Padre Pio had truly been a man of God. Even today, decades after his death, Padre Pio's legacy continues to inspire millions. Pilgrims from all over the world travel to San Giovanni Rotondo to visit the place where he lived and died. They come seeking healing, comfort, and a deeper connection to their faith, drawn by the extraordinary life of a humble friar who bore the marks of Christ and devoted his life to serving others. And though he is no longer physically present, his spirit continues to live on in the hearts of those who knew him and those who have come to know him through his enduring legacy. What aspect of Padre Pio life do you find more intriguing? Drop it in the comment section below. If you enjoyed watching this video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.
Skeptics agree that it's at least 600 years old. So while they dismiss the idea that the shroud is evidence of a miracle, they can't explain how the image was made.
This again suggests that in some way the body covered by the shroud became mechanically transparent, and that the cloth fell into and through this body. Otherwise, if this were not the case, the image would be only the outside of the body. Father Spitzer concludes, currently, known laws of physics cannot explain how a decomposing body can create an intense burst of vacuum ultraviolet radiation. Apart from that, they are also unable to account for how such a body could ever achieve mechanical transparency and start radiating from each three-dimensional point within it. Though this cannot be proved on scientific ground, yet, from the nature of such radiation, it may well be inferred that there is some trans-physical cause that acts as the cause for the emission of such radiation. After all, Jesus was not only resurrected from the dead, but his body was transformed from a physical to a glorified trans-physical one. Remember, he could walk through solid doors, yet he was not a ghost. The apostles touched him, and he dined with them. The theory that the image on the shroud was created when a dead body disappeared requires us to set aside the laws of physics, or at least stretch them grotesquely. One physicist, for example, postulated in a letter to the journal Nature that the event that created the image involved an outpouring of light and heat, as well as neutrons which could have thrown off the carbon dating result. While that's technically true, Robert Hedges, an author on the 1988 carbon dating paper, wrote in a response,
Scientists who in 1988 used carbon dating to determine the age of the fabric say it's not old enough to be the cloth used to wrap Jesus' body.
There is also no evidence that it's possible for a human body to spontaneously vanish in a flurry of neutrons. As logical as that statement may be, the legacy of scientific research on the shroud reveals a curious attempt to marry the rigor of science to the mystery of religion. Some believe religion needs no experiments to prove its worth, and those who hunger for evidence. It is also of note worth noting that over the years, various researchers have attempted to replicate the Shroud of Turin using different standard techniques. This probably must have stemmed from frustration due to failure to solve the puzzle of the shroud, no matter how much effort and advanced science and technology are employed. Be that as it may, it seemed that they were going to rack their thinking brains to eternity, as no facsimile or mock was able to present the shroud and the mechanism of appearance of its image. The mocks were also devoid of the homogeneity and the fine details of the original as well. There is no other artifact similar to it, and hence no convincing explanation of how the shroud with its perfectly anatomical picture came into being. Several studies on the anatomical consistency of the image on the shroud and the nature of the wounds on it have also been performed, following the initial study by Yves Delage in 1902. While Delage declared the image anatomically flawless, others have presented arguments to support both authenticity and forgery. Both art historical digital image processing and analog techniques have been applied to the shroud images. In 1976, scientists used NASA imaging equipment to analyze a photograph of the shroud image and decoded the shroud image into a three-dimensional image. Optical physicist and former STURP member John D. German has noted that it is not difficult to make a photograph that has 3D qualities. If the object being photographed is lit from the front, and a non-reflective fog of some sort exists between the camera and the object, then less light will reach and reflect from the portions of the object that are farther from the lens, thus creating a contrast which is dependent on distance. But the strange thing is, such technology never existed in those times. While the blood images could have come from a contact mechanism, the body image could not. The mapping between body-only image densities and expected cloth body distances is not consistent with the image having been formed by direct contact with a body, as it is present even when it does not seem possible for the cloth to be in contact with the body.
As far as he's concerned, his process ticks every box. It leaves no brush marks. It leaves no trace of pigment. It requires no modern technology.
Many scientists who claim to know better tried to solve this puzzle. In 2009, Luigi Garlascelli, professor of organic chemistry at the University of Pavia, stated that he had made a full-size reproduction of the Shroud of Turin using only medieval technologies. Garlascelli placed a linen sheet over a volunteer and then rubbed it with an acidic pigment. The shroud was then aged in an oven before being washed to remove the pigment. He then added blood stains, scorches, and water stains to replicate the original. To the disappointment of many, the technique was unable to produce an image having the most critical Turin shroud image characteristics. There is yet to be a conclusive answer about how the image came to be imprinted on the fabric. In 1978, an international team of experts tried and failed to work out how the image might have been formed. This investigation was carried out under the Shroud of Turin research project. The project did find that the image was not a painting because the team found no remnants of dye or pigment. Many attempts have been made at reproducing the image on the Shroud of Turin, none of which have met with success. Artistic attempts at duplicating the image using paint, ink, and even blood have failed absolutely. The picture on the shroud lacks the hallmark brushstrokes and layering or other evidence of human artistry by any attempts to replicate the image with conventional techniques of art to succeed. Other photographers have attempted to take the image with several photographic techniques, such as infrared photography, ultraviolet photography, and even X-ray photography. None of these has successfully captured in detail the reality of the image on the shroud. The picture on the shroud seems to break all the laws of photography, and consequently, that of science. Scientists have tried to produce the image using chemicals like acid etchings, alkaline etchings, and even scorched imaging without success. Experiments involving radiation have also been conducted where cloth is exposed to very high levels of radiation, but all attempts have failed to produce an image quality comparable to what we see on the shroud. They have even gone to the extent of simulating the act of burial and decomposition by wrapping a cloth around a corpse and allowing it to decompose. However, those experiments have also failed to produce an image that looked remotely similar to that on the shroud. Other theories propose that the shroud is a medieval forgery, but these have largely been discredited because evidence is scanty.
They wrapped his body in a shroud and then, aloes and everything else on his body, and they put it in the tomb. And then we're told on the morning of the third day, how far does it date back? Is it a medieval forgery?
And such theories are mired in inconsistencies. Attempts at replicas with alternative materials, cotton, and even synthetic fibers cannot achieve properties of the original, such as the exact bloodstain patterns or uniformity of the image. Despite all these researches and experiments, the shroud remains an anomaly to this date and still keeps its secret well. The very failure of these attempts at miracle achievement adds more mystery and intrigue to the Shroud of Turin. Despite public debate about its authenticity, it continues to attract pilgrims from around the world and remains the subject of public interest. It urges us not just to seek the spiritual dimension it embodies, but also stands as a testament to the Christian faith. Do you think the Shroud of Turin is genuine? Leave your opinion in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to the channels. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.